Hi, welcome to this little webinar, which is the first in a short series of webinars, which we're calling the Foundation of the Gut. So a few weeks ago, David and I met and we had a nice talk about how fermentation is key to our gut health. So very soon we will be showing that video for all of you. After the video, which is going to be around 25 minutes, we will both be available for questions. We should have 15, 20 minutes for that. Please do write your question as it comes to your mind. So when you're listening to the video, feel free to pop in the question or at the end of it. So the way you post a question, on the right-hand side of your screen, there's a button that says questions. If you post your question in there, it will be anonymous and no one can see it. If you do want to have your question available for everyone, you can also write it in the chat function. That one everyone will be seeing. So yeah. Hope you enjoy the video and see you in a moment. Hi David, welcome here to a little chat about fermentation.
Well, thank you for having me.
So today we're here to talk about fermentation, the fascinating world of fermentation and how probiotics are all linked to that. But first of all, you started as a butcher, chef, and then you've ended up as this fermentation expert and author of the Gnoma Guide to Fermentation. How did you end up there?
How did I end up in fermentation? I mean, I've been trained as a chef. You know, I started cooking when I was still in high school and have been working with food for some over 20 years now. Yeah. But I think my real big foray happened when I started at Gnoma as a chef de partie, just working in the kitchen. And after about half a year, my head chef, David Zilber, thought maybe I had a bit of a scientific inclination, which I absolutely do. I love the sciences, and transferred me over to the fermentation lab, where the investigation of fermented foods for the creation of new flavors and new ingredients became my wholesale task at the restaurant. Yeah. So that was really my deepest dive into the world of fermented foods, and I was really lucky to get to explore them in a way that not a lot of people do.
Yeah. Yes, and that's actually also where we met. I think a little disclaimer, none of us are microbiome experts or probiotic experts. We are both different professionals that have been drawn to the world of fermentation and getting more and more curious, digging deeper and deeper in what's happening there, and that's how we first got into contact.
Taking your yeasts and your bacteria, putting them into experiments in the laboratory, and feeding you back results.
Yeah, we've both really been on a journey, going deeper and deeper into fermentation and understanding it and how it connects.
I think just the world of fermented foods in general, it offers this amazing, it really does act as like a porthole into this whole kind of Alice in Wonderland world of like possibility and potential. Once you start working with microbes, even the most simple capacity, whether it's a pickle or a kombucha or brewing your own wine on purpose or accidentally, you start to kind of investigate how these things fit together, and you really learn that they touch and affect a much larger world than what you have on your plate in front of you. Yeah, and it's all around us. I think the more you dig, the more fascinating it becomes, and that's also why I've now ended up working about it in how does it actually work in your gut, what's happening down there, to find out that there's a whole other ecosystem that we need to take care of, and how does that link to what we are actually eating. So that's kind of the main topic of today, linking those things, the plate around the fermentation process, and how does it link to us. But fermentation came way before we had any clue of microbes. Yeah. So how do you think it's kind of really shaped the way we eat and our lives, if we look back a little bit? Yeah, well, I always like to say that there's like no such thing as a perfect boundary or a perfect container. Mm-hmm. Even at the most fundamental physical level, everything kind of is a little bit porous in nature and bleeds in and out of each other. And a lot of, not just human health, but organismic health in general is about mediating that boundary, keeping inside things in and outside things out, and letting in only the things that you desire or would be, fruitful to your continued existence. In nature, there's all this talk of the human microbiome, but we also have to understand that every living thing in the world has its own microbiome. Microbes that live on and inside of plants, of insects, even bacteria have their own, microbiome. Viruses that they can tolerate and viruses that would seek to do them harm. And so naturally, whenever any organism, be it an ant or a bee or a jellyfish, consumes some sort of food or metabolizes, proteins or carbohydrates in environments, it inevitably, also brings in these forms of life. Some of which it has, they've evolved to tolerate. Some of which they've evolved to be codependent on, and some of which they, try to, eschew from their bodies. Organisms that would seek to do them harm. And humans are no different. So, it's long been documented. And we can also see in the evolutionary history of our own species that, chimpanzees, gorillas, our closest relatives in nature, have their own kind of symbiotic, partners in life, organisms that help them to digest, roughage and leaves and the foods and fruits that they consume. And likewise, so do we. Yeah. Our microbiome has evolved alongside of us in the foods we eat, helping us to digest a lot of those foods, and it continues into the present day.
When we're talking about fermentation, now we're talking a lot about the gut fermentation, but we also have these basic fermentations in our everyday life that we see. So we have sourdough bread, we may be consuming yogurt every day. Do you think, so all these food traditions of fermentation, have they been driven by just like pure deliciousness, that it was tasting super good, or have we also been like feeling that link that this was good for us? I think it's fascinating how there's been so much fermentation of food. We've lost quite a bit of it. We can talk about that later. But what has been driving that? Has it been stability, deliciousness, health?
I think that a lot of the same factors that kind of drive biological evolution, like something works or it doesn't, and the thing that doesn't work is eventually lost from that genetic lineage. I think a lot of that also maps onto cultural evolution and the way that recipes are transmitted from grandmothers to granddaughters, and then carried through time. Just think of the simple experiment, the thought experiment of like two farmers in adjacent fields, somewhere in Eastern Europe growing cabbages. One of them, submerges their cabbages at the end of the season, all of their surplus, into salt brine, and it lasts, it ferments, it holds in their wooden barrel, into the spring when they have fresh food again. And the other doesn't really figure out how to do that, and all of his cabbages either wilt or get consumed by fungus and rot in a cellar. Obviously, the person who has kept their cabbages edible will be around in the spring to do it again, have offspring, and continue his lineage. So you can see how there is that kind of link between the success of people and their recipes and of like evolutionary lineages. I really do think that fermentation encompasses all sorts of happy accidents in the history of humankind. The invention of bread, milling flour, letting it just sit with water, having a porridge that might have, naturally and wildly attracted yeast and bacteria that made it rise. And then you see this bubbling mass in a bowl and say, oh, what if I cooked this over the fire? And all of a sudden, aha, there's bread. And it's obviously something that's so nutritious and so delicious that you keep doing it.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. It's this like link between that it is tasty, then you keep on eating it, and then you've also been surviving. It's just amazing how that link has been there the whole time.
These are things that absolutely kept us going.
Yeah. So before we dig too deep into fermentation, just get the facts clear. What is fermentation actually?
Fermentation, to me, in simple layman's terms, I know that if you've studied microbiology at your level and metabolic pathways, you have a very strict definition. But I think that the easiest way for most people to understand it is the transformation of some food source into another with the help of microbes. Be that filamentous fungi or yeast or bacteria. But the idea that you're taking something edible and then turning it into something else that's edible. But a cucumber is not a pickle. The porridge is not bread, and grape juice is not wine. So you can see that transformative process, and it really only is over the past 150 or so years that we've understood that it was microbes involved in that transformation. Yeah, so I think that's kind of the easiest way to hammer it home for people.
And what's also fascinating with the fermentation process is not only is it changing the flavor. Yeah, so I think your example with the pickle and the cucumber, it's a great example of how fermentation transforms taste. But the more I'm getting to understand about how it actually also transforms nutritional compounds in there. So breaking down, making it easier digestible, but even producing different compounds that we need. Even vitamins can be produced from the fermentation process.
Like I always like to say that, it's very easy to, use a nutritional label guideline that's based off of, laboratory results for very, very strict, very kind of sterile processing of simple ingredients that you would see on most things in a grocery store. Wheat flour has so much calories per gram, but that doesn't necessarily translate to how your body processes it. How the food is cooked, how much you've had to eat that day, all sorts of factors can influence how much nutrition you actually can reap from these foods. And where fermentation really offers a benefit in terms of, its nutritional impact is basically these microbes are helping to pre-digest this food for you and make all of the nutrients that your body would have a difficult time breaking down more readily available. Proteins get chopped up into the amino acids that compose them like little Lego bricks. Same thing for starches into sugars. And along with that come all of the secondary and tertiary metabolites that these microbes produce for, their own benefit. Molecules that might be beneficial to them in trying to keep out, competing organisms can actually be really useful to our own bodies.
So it is really impacting our health by both transforming the food before we eat it, and then as you're also kind of getting to the fact that what you have in your stomach is also going to have a lot to say with how you digest it. So if you go back to that flour, we've maybe made it into bread, depending on the day, all sorts of circumstances around us, but also the gut microbiome. How do we then digest it? What are we getting out of the food, and how does it impact us? Is kind of slightly out of our control, right? It's a different ecosystem living down there, a whole other universe that's down there.
Yeah, but I would like to think that as the science progresses, we're learning more and more about how to influence that kind of garden within us. What foods we eat that can better foster diversity, and what foods might contain beneficial microbes that actually do us good when they pass through our system.
Exactly. Yeah, so we are really learning that it's a symbiosis. We're all living and interlinked, and I think we've potentially understood this ecosystem for longer out in nature, that if we took out a species, if we're looking at the animal, if we remove one indigenous species, we're kind of interrupting this whole ecosystem and things will change. But it seems like it's not really different within our gut microbiome and that ecosystem that's happening there. When we're changing things, removing things, it can be disrupted and be changing. And that's maybe how we have to look at it going ahead. How do we nourish this gut microbiome and have it as robust as possible?
Yeah, and that definitely touches on the concept of the holobiont, which kind of translates, from Latin to the whole organism. And there was this very kind of singular view of species that stems from Darwinian theories of evolution that we're kind of individual beings within a larger ecosystem within the world. But we are now learning that we're kind of like folded in and on top of each other, and that every organism is itself an environment.
And all connected.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's just
interdependent.
Such, interdependent system that we have going on everywhere, all around us.
Absolutely.
I've heard quite a lot of people talk about the fact that we've kind of maybe lost connection with the microbes because of the way we've been eating. We're buying foods in the supermarket, they're packaged, they have this nutritional profile in the back. So that whole connection with knowing that microbes is a part of us and we maybe need to consume them or have fermented foods. So yes, have we lost the connection to microbes in our everyday lives?
Yeah, this stems from, it's ironic in that when Louis Pasteur first discovered that microbes are everywhere and developed his germ theory of both disease but also of fermented foods. We also can't forget that the fact that we understand microbiology at all comes from Louis Pasteur studying wine and beer and bread.
So he was a lovely combination of a winemaker and a doctor.
Yeah.
So that was a very cool combination, very useful for us now.
Absolutely. But that also kind of spurred on this hygienesis theory in the late 1800s, that now that there were microbes everywhere, we kind of villainized them and sought to kind of rid them from our environment, and justly so. You know, infectious disease was a huge problem like overpopulated cities back then. But that kind of came with a lot of baggage that lasted well over 100 years. I mean, growing up in the 80s and 90s, I was in a household with a mother that would spray, you know, disinfectant on every surface after, you know, she cooked a meal with chicken or things like that. And rightly so. You know, there are, you know, problematic bacteria and organisms that can make you sick. But I think what we kind of missed in all that is that by just using, you know, antibacterial cleaning agents that just kill all life, we were getting rid of a lot of commensal and harmless bacteria that help to inform our health and just take up space in the environment. You know, we can't forget that if, you know, the parking lot is full of friends who are invited to your party, you know, a van full of robbers have nowhere to come and sneak in and, you know, plan their big burglary. That's kind of how nature works as well. There are a lot of organisms that don't really do us harm, that don't really, you know, seek to exploit our bodies or our health. But when we remove them from the scenario, we actually leave a lot of vacant space for problematic organisms and even our own immune system to wreak havoc. So absolutely, by being less in touch with microbes, by being you know, raised in highly sterilized environments, you know, there's problems of autoimmune disease that stem from this lack of kind of interaction with the world around us. And it's not just in our homes and in our kitchens and in our bathrooms that this is taking place, also in our food supply. You know, as foods that we eat have become more and more industrialized, as things we take off the grocery store shelves have become more and more pasteurized and kind of sterile, ready to last for indefinite periods of time, we've also missed out on one of the chief sources of microbial information through that avenue as well. You know, by giving up whole foods that were grown in the dirt and, you know, not irradiated and things like that, we lose that connection with the world around us.
So we've kind of taken it too far, I think. So we needed to know that there was bad microbes out there. We needed to protect ourselves, and rightly so. But I think maybe we got better and better at making it cleaner and cleaner and everything, and as our knowledge and science. And I think it seems like now we're on the verge of kind of a new revelation of understanding, okay, but there's also a whole lot of good guys. And not only are they good, they're potentially essential for us and our general well-being. So how do we have that right balance in there? And I don't know, I've been thinking about if that whole fermentation has come back into the food via this very gourmet restaurants actually starting it. And then we've seen this fairly new trend of people home fermenting. So sourdough went crazy a few years back, and kimchi and sauerkraut. And I'm kind of hoping that that's giving people a feeling again for that microbes can be good and not bad. Do you think that's kind of going to help us in the direction of understanding that we're more connected to the microbes and we need to be closer and not be so scared of them as well? Maybe?
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely think that there's a bit of cultural zeitgeist around our awareness of fermented foods and the role of microbes in our lives and our world and in our health. You know, it's very hard to even imagine that 10, 15 years ago you wouldn't see probiotic anything on a label in a grocery store, or even, you know, the public just sense of bacteria, what that made someone feel was probably negative. Very different.
I think you're right.
It had a negative connotation,
and that's turning a bit.
Yeah,
that's
like microbes have had a little bit of a glow up, and I think it's because, you know,
which they should.
The influence is coming from a lot of different directions. I think the internet is definitely helping to allow people to communicate. You know, there is this kind of fermentation revivalism that didn't necessarily start in high-end restaurants, but also helped to fuel those kind of adoptions. And places like Noma, where I used to work, absolutely help to kind of champion the deliciousness and the benefits of eating fermented food on a regular basis.
Making them a bit trendy again.
Sexy.
Making people curious, what is this about?
Absolutely.
Now you mentioned probiotics, we also need to get into that before all the time is gone. probiotics. We're now starting to understand that there's some strains out there that have this benefit to the host being us in this effect, but it's coming from fermented foods, right?
Yeah.
So it's been there for a long time, and I think maybe we've seen some populations that have been benefiting from it and eating it, and others that haven't. How's your view on probiotics? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, the entire field of probiotics, again, kind of goes back to, the century past, where Ilya Mechnikov, a physician working in Paris, realized that a lot of Bulgarian patients that he would see had like extremely long-lived family members and lives themselves, and he was fascinated by this. Like, how come this subset of the European population lives so long? So he, went on a field trip basically, did an expedition to Bulgaria to investigate what about their lifestyle helped them to be so healthy, and he discovered that they were eating a lot of yogurt. That this traditional food source was conferring some sort of health benefit that allowed them to live very healthy and long lives, much longer than people in France, anyway. And with microbiology being a new field and a new tool in his toolbox, he investigated what bacteria are growing and isolated Lactobacillus bulgaricus, as he dubbed it.
Yeah.
And he might have gotten a little bit of the science wrong. He thought that it kind of conferred some sort of effluent effect on the people that consumed it that allowed them to like eschew pathogens and poisons, and it wasn't exactly that, but nonetheless he was barking up the right tree. That strain of bacteria is still used in yogurt production and in probiotic production to this day. So a lot of probiotics that we know today are actually harvested from fermented foods, or at least closely related genera and species. Now there is a very strict term around the concept of probiotics, and that is one that has had a proven effect in like a verified study to offer some sort or confer some sort of health benefit unto a host that consumes it. And that is a very strict definition, but we can't forget that in populations that do consume a lot of fermented foods, whether it's in Japan, whether it's in Southeast Asia, or whether it is in Eastern Europe, there is that kind of larger sweeping kind of group effect that you see, okay, well, populations are healthier, or there are less instances of heart disease or other non-communicable diseases in people that consume a lot of fermented foods.
And obviously, we haven't found them all. We've been scratching the surface, and we've found some strains that we can now prove, and as you say, document, and if you have enough in an adequate amount and consume them live, it'll have an impact. But of course, there's loads of undiscovered ones out there.
And it's also extremely complex. The interactions between not just the microbes, but also the substrate and other factors in the environment. But the fact that we can pick out single strains that we know to be beneficial to human health is nonetheless impressive and groundbreaking, I think.
Potentially a bit of a game changer to human health. I believe personally that this is interesting, and we can also see it. So it's not just driven by a belief, and we like the fermented food. There's actually science showing that the gut microbiome is important, that probiotics are important, that all this interaction with microbe really has an impact on our health. And it is fascinating that it is reaching consumers. They are getting curious of where does this come from, how can I have a more holistic view on my own health by making sure that I have a robust gut, that it's ready to tackle anything. And there's different ways of doing that. But a lot of people are looking at what are they eating and how does it impact their gut and their well-being. So we really so the whole saying of you are what you eat, I think is taking to the next level now. It is really what you eat that defines what your microbiome looks like, largely.
Absolutely.
So before we round off here, do you have any personal wow experience with fermentation and how it has impacted yours or other people's health? I collaborate with the Human Microbiome Institute at Stanford University quite a bit. Justin Sonnenberg is a good friend of mine, as well as some of his my PhD students. And every time I'm on the phone with him or we meet at a conference, he's telling me something fascinating about the intersection of fermented food and human health. He shows me the bar charts where you see huge deviations in, health outcomes with, controlled studies where he's feeding these patients
like loaded diets of fermented foods, and that is the nature of the study. And in my own life, I eat a lot of fermented foods because it's been my bag for quite some time, and I always have sauerkraut, pickles, pickled jalapenos, and kimchi in the fridge at home. And I feel pretty good. Like generally, maybe I'm a bit biased. Maybe I'm a bit biased, but on a day-to-day basis, I feel pretty good about my gut and my own health. And I've gotten also countless messages and emails telling me people who've committed to diets of eating either probiotic-rich foods or fermented foods on a regular basis. And they're like, look at these before and after pictures. Or I had problems with my digestion before, and I started making recipes for, like a fiber-rich diet and eating lots of yogurt in the morning, and it's completely changed my life. So, the proof is in the pudding.
Yeah, it turns out that the old saying of trust your gut and your gut feeling is potentially very, very true, right? So thank you for joining today, David. It's been an interesting talk about fermentation and our overall well-being and gut health.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Hi, we are back again here. It has been buzzing in with questions, so that's great. I think we'll just start from the top.
Yeah.
Does the microbiome, does it get affected by changing area? Like if a person is living in one country and then moves to another, so food and culture will change. So how will it affect the gut microbiome?
Yeah. The gut microbiome is heavily dependent on your surroundings, environment. I mean, they use you as an environment, and you use your environment as an environment. So of course, there's going to be these cascading effects that kind of ricochet all the way down inside of you.
I think there's also a lot of studies showing, especially if you move from the countryside, right, to the cities, that also just has a major impact. So that's really the surroundings.
Yeah, absolutely. But diet is one of the most influential components of what shapes your microbiome. And I know there's studies that kind of look at diets in disparate places, whether that's Europe or the United States, and find that people who eat a lot of the same things, if that's a lot of meat and potatoes, have very similar microbiological makeups inside of them. So think about how different those two places might be if you're moving from Sichuan in China to Peru. Obviously those will be quite different diets, and you'll probably see a similar reflection in the difference in one's microbiome because of it. But yes, like individual people have their own microbiological halos, they're sometimes called. And when you move in with a new boyfriend or girlfriend, your microbiome will change, and you'll change each other's based off of your new living situation. Whether you have pets in your house is another way that you can actually influence your microbiome. So there's so much complexity involved, and there's so many factors that everything you touch kind of changes you a little bit. Absolutely.
So it's both the surroundings, what you eat, everything. So that's if you change lifestyle, you will probably also be changing your gut microbiome. Is every fermented food, will it have an effect on your gut? Like pickle effect is different from wine?
For sure, but I would say that from those two examples, that there's an important consideration to take into account, that wine is alcoholic.
Yeah.
And alcohol kills off microbes. So a lot of studies have shown that an excess of alcohol is really not great for your microbiome, and that heavy drinking actively diminishes the health of the species and diversity inside of you. I think a lot of people come to the consensus that in moderation, a little bit isn't bad. But even from a microbial point of view, yeast produce alcohol to kill other microorganisms. And even though it's also the case that, lactic acid bacteria produce lactic acid to do much the same thing, it is much gentler porcupine spike.
It's not as effective as alcohol is.
Exactly. So yeah, they're not all the same, and they will have different effects, and they will have different rates of the amount of living probiotics or microbes that actually make their way inside of you and stick around for a little bit.
And it also depends on which microbes they are and what you're kind of feeding them. So if it's grapes or if it's cucumbers, they will have different things to work with and different synergies. I've always thought about wine fermentation. It's kind of like if you have a lot of different yeast in there, like having a lot of different chefs using ingredients in different ways.
Yeah.
And of course, it will give them different ingredients depending on what you put them into and who they're together with.
Yeah. Here's another one. We'll split this question up. Of all the uncommon fermented foods we've come across, which ones would we like to become more mainstream? One for health properties and one for amazing flavor.
Yes, that's
health properties.
Health properties came to mind immediately. I would say the Japanese natto. It's probably not for its flavors, but for its health properties. So natto, if people don't know it, is this fermented soybeans, kind of a gooey texture. It's very used in the northern parts of Japan as kind of a daily staple they put into foods. What is interesting about natto is that it is a K27 superfood. So the fermentation produces a lot of this K27, which is a really essential vitamin for us humans to be sure that we get enough calcium into our bones. And it's not a lot of foods out there that actually contain it. It's actually only some fermented foods, and this natto is just a superfood. So if we had that as more of a mainstream and maybe made it a more appealing to everyone, we would not be insufficient in vitamin K2, which most of us in the Western world actually are.
Yeah. And for flavor, I would say one of the most incredible kind of unknown ferments that I've come across, and something that does have a lot of historical context, is the fermented pulp of cocoa. So the actual cocoa pods. People don't know this about chocolate. You know, people see cocoa nibs and they think, oh, it just must be like another bean-like coffee that gets crushed up. But it's actually like a football-sized fruit that's like bright yellow and green and red. And inside is all of this incredibly sticky, incredibly sweet white flesh wrapping up the actual cocoa seeds that then gets ground up into cocoa powder and chocolate. That fruit was like the prized possession of like Mayan chiefs, and they would ferment it and drink it.
So it became a beverage at
the
end.
Like a pulpy mass, and you kind of juice it. Pachada coco is one name for it in Ecuador. But I've tried that, and it is incredible. If there was ever a way to commoditize that
mainstream
and to rein in the wild microbiology that helps you produce it, I think the drinks industry would be forever
would be good
changed.
For the cocoa industry. They're suffering a bit. It's,
for lots of reasons. Okay, next question. Quantity wise, how much probiotics should be taken on a daily basis, or like what recommended amount of probiotics should be consumed on a daily basis, and how can we measure that amount? And likewise, how do we know how much fermented food we should eat on the same occasion, and what quantity of fermented food is good to consume on a daily basis?
A lot of questions in that. I think generally it's when we're adding probiotics to food, if we do that, we would say that you always need at least 1 billion CFU, so that's actually living cells, and that would be the minimum, but you can easily go significantly higher than that and have 5 billion or something a day. But the 1 billion is actually set so you can actually have an effect. So you want to say that's the least. You should check the products if it says it on it. If it has in the US, if it has a structure function health claim, so it's claiming it's good, support your gut health or something, it should have at least that 1 billion. But if it just says probiotic, you actually can't be sure.
Mm-hmm. And it's important to note that if you buy a probiotic capsule, that will come with a daily dose, like take one in the morning and one in the evening or something to that effect. And the dose that they actually put inside of those pills is the recommended amount, and they'll usually have on the label the amount of colony forming units or CFUs that you are ingesting, and that is decided upon in clinical trials, in studies where they know what amount of microbes actually survive, your stomach acid and then pass on to the intestinal system, and what amount is required to see an effect. So on the like probiotics as a pill side, that's kind of taken care of for you.
Known probiotic, documented one, but then there's the fermented food question, which is also really interesting.
Yeah, in fermented foods, it's a lot harder. You can't really know if you're just doing fermentation at home what quantity of microbes are actually growing. There's obviously enough to have an effect, but there is one study that I am acutely aware of because I work with this man, but Justin Sonnenberg of Stanford University and the Center for Human Microbiome Research published a very famous study out of his lab about fermented foods versus fiber. And I think the amount of food that he fed his participants in this one study was something around like 100 grams a day, and that was considered high. So you'd have your dinner. It would be like, a few ounces of yogurt in the morning as your fermented food, and then maybe that was like sauerkraut with your lunch, with your lentils or something in the afternoon, and then if you're having like kimchi over like brown rice or something for dinner. So 100 grams, that's not a huge amount. That's like kind of 3 good tablespoons. And that was enough to really tip the scales and prove that fermented foods had an added impact on people's health outside of just consuming fiber and prebiotics. So that makes the metric very rough. It doesn't talk about the amount of bacteria that are actually living in all of those things, but as a rough guide, it serves as a pretty good and reasonable quantity that people would want to consume on a daily basis.
And I think like the diversity, so not just going crazy on one thing, like have different fermented foods, different probiotics products would all be good. I'm a bit curious, you mentioned how was the impact of the fibers, because the fibers are kind of often seen as the prebiotics.
Yeah.
So in that study, how did that compare? Do you recall?
The fiber did have an effect. It did improve people's health. They were looking for really specific markers. I just pulled up the study here in advance of this question. 19 inflammatory proteins were measured to have decreased. Interleukin-6 linked to conditions such as rheumatoid arthritis, type 2 diabetes, and chronic stress. And all of those markers dropped across both studies, but there was an even more marked effect in the fermented food
one. I remember,
Yeah.
Interesting.
Next question. What are the gaps in knowledge regarding fermentation? Where does science need to push to understand the fundamental gaps that still reside in this topic? I would definitely say the interactions between species. I think that is this kind of undiscovered country in what's called like the metabolome. So we have the microbiome. We also have the virome when we talk about what viruses kind of inhabit the human body, but there is also the metabolome, and these are the byproducts that microbes produce. So lactic acid is a byproduct of fermentation, and that is a metabolite. But there are tons of secondary and tertiary metabolites that don't just affect your own body, but also affect the interactions with other microbes. In microbiology, there's a phenomenon called quorum sensing, where microbes act differently based off of the other signals that microbes in their surroundings put out. And once there's kind of a threshold reach, you can have whole changes in physiology and behavior kind of cascade through a population. And when we consider just how diverse the human microbiome is, just in terms of species, let alone interactions within single species, you see this kind of web of interaction in that cascade of waves of activity, spread out into intractable complexity. So a lot of work is being done in that space is to understand how microbes inside of you, or inside fermented foods for that matter.
It's everywhere we are. Yeah. It's that interaction that we are getting better, and we can now start to study it, but there's still a lot to understand. The sensing and how they produce different compounds for each other.
I mean,
that's super complex, but it's super relevant because they, as you said, it can change the whole behavior of them. Who were they together with? What are the conditions they're under? That's where we need a better understanding. If we really want to understand the gut microbiome, if we really want to understand some of these traditional fermented foods, which often are very complex, and maybe not just even yeast, but yeast and bacteria potentially, and other things in there.
Do you think our diets will become a larger part of a preventative approach to healthier lives compared to today? Absolutely.
Absolutely. I think we're really seeing consumers taking this preventative approach to their health, and they're looking at food. And that's kind of the new wave we're seeing. They're a little bit fed up with their medication and only that being treating it. What can I do to prevent it? And getting to understand that what they're eating has a major impact on their health. So absolutely.
Yeah. And it is a trend, it's grandmotherly wisdom, like eat your vegetables, but research is starting to show, and the market is starting to show that people are paying attention to that and looking for answers in it. Here's a kind of good follow-up question. Given the growing awareness of food's impact on health and the increasing ignorance around these topics, especially in schools, how do you think we can effectively change the culture surrounding food education in educational institutions? Have you been involved in any initiatives or projects aimed at improving this aspect of schooling? I did a panel last night talking a little bit about biodiversity and its kind of role in fermentation, but also in agriculture and the food system in general. And this was exactly what I said. I said that, people won't be able to understand how to eat healthier for themselves until they're given the tools to be able to do so. And I, recall that in home economics class when I was a teenager, which was not a very intensive course, it was maybe like a quarter of the school year, and half of it was spent sewing little stuffed animals together. But we were learning how to make like old El Paso taco kits and, like toads in a hole. And that's not exactly like healthy eating. That's like bare minimum survival. So I think that like really pushing educators and school board directors and politicians to understand that these are essential life skills that people should carry with them their entire lives and should be instilled in them at a very young age is crucial for the well-being of not just like individual people, but nations and the cost to health systems.
Yeah, and the school food as well, where there should be much more attention to that, and not just the behavior of the kids and maybe not being able to sit still, but if the food isn't actually supporting them.
Have I been involved in any initiatives or projects? I have been involved with an outfit called Brigade a little bit, where I taught people working within institutional food and school food in the United States. I was kind of given like a black box project to, come up with a really delicious vegan meal that would be extremely healthy on a budget that would meet the kind of U.S. government guidelines for what a spend per child is. And I made like a mushroomy, shepherd's pie packed with vegetables and things like that. And so I actually saw someone, a school food chef, recreate that, and he tagged me online, and so that was kind of nice. But that was just, I've done that a few times for people, giving sessions to people who are working in school food. It's a drop in the bucket compared to the change that needs to happen.
It's on a higher level.
Very thoughtful question.
Unfortunately, time is actually running out. We've only got 2 minutes left.
Okay. We have one last one.
Do we have one last one? There's a lot of unanswered, so don't worry. We will get back to you in email if your question has not been answered here live. One last one.
Maybe there was one about apple cider vinegar.
Yes.
And I think this was actually a pre-question, so that we should get to that. But I think it was something to the effect, it's not in this chat right now, but it's something to the effect of...
What do we think about the effect of apple cider vinegar on your gut health?
Yeah. Well, there is a lot of spurious... there are a lot of spurious claims around, the health benefits of drinking something like kombucha. And while we do see people who have fermentation-intensive diets, generally kind of see better health outcomes, not everything that's ever been said about kombucha is true. No, it doesn't heal cancer, and whoever was drinking a lot of kombucha when they recovered from cancer or put it into remission is probably like a one-off.
Yeah.
So those incredible claims we can kind of disregard as being outliers, but there are some studies coming in that show that acetic acid bacteria, which is the type of bacteria that exists in kombucha and in apple cider vinegar, have a lot of the same characteristics as registered probiotics. So there are a lot of scientists looking into the role of acetic acid bacteria and trying to understand if that does kind of meet the level of scrutiny required for a probiotic definition.
Yeah.
So
but until now, there hasn't actually been found any acetic acid bacteria that's been proven to be probiotic if we look at like the definition. That was for certain the last question that we got to answer today. Before we finish, I would like to invite you all to join the second webinar we're going to be hosting in this line of the foundation of the gut, where we're going to be diving a bit more into the gut microbiome and how it affects you. So there'll be shared a link in the chat where you can sign up. It's going to be on October 8th. And I'll be joined by 3 experts, which have different fields of expertise within the microbiome and probiotics. We have Adam Baker, that's definitely Mr. Probiotic, knows everything there is to know about that and how bacteria impact our lives as we are throughout our lives, actually, from the very beginning to the end. We have Rebecca Riploli, a nutritionist, who will talk a bit more and give us an insights on what we eat and how that impacts our gut microbiome. And we all have Emilie Gladbach, who has been looking a lot into the gut microbiome and how that actually impacts our health. So please do join me for that on October 8th and sign up. And thank you for now.
Thank you. Ciao.